Hey guys, welcome to class. So today we're going to talk about a specific topic that directly relates to you and how it impacts our country. Okay, so we're going to start today's lesson by looking at this map. We've seen a lot of maps before. Some of them kind of look very similar to this. We can see our compass, our not our compass, our key right down here in the corner with some percentages in different colors, and then the countries around the world are shaded in those country or into those colors. Any guesses on what this map is showing? And I understand that it's hard to tell what the map is showing without a map title, and I have some question marks up there to kind of take the place of the title. So I just gave you a second to kind of think about it. Hopefully, you can draw in what we discussed in the previous lesson of economics growth, because this map is showing you the literacy rates. So that map showing you the literacy rate of the countries around the world. Okay, and as a kind of a refresher, if you didn't remember, literacy rate is the percentage of a population over the age of 15 that can read and write. So the higher that percentage of a literacy rate, the more individuals in that country over the age of 15 that can read or write. The lower the percentage, the lower the population. Okay. So getting into literacy rate, a literate person is one who can read and write. Being literate is a major factor in whether a person can get a job and be successful in a workplace. Again, the definition of the literacy rate is the percentage of a country's population over the age of 15 that can read and write. And just to kind of let you know where our literacy rate is here in the United States, it's very high. About 99% of Americans are literate, which means 99% of our population here in the United States is able to read and write, which is really good. So, what is the economic impact of literacy rate? Okay, so countries with higher literacy rates are generally wealthier, which means they make more money. They can compete in the world economy. Having a high literacy rate is important to the success of the people in a country. People who can read and can get better jobs, earn more money, and can afford better things. They can afford housing, food, healthcare, and clothing for their families. Okay, so individuals that are able to read and write has been proven statistically. Those individuals are more successful in life. They usually get better jobs. They make more money, which means they can then afford their needs. We talked about needs in the intro to economics lesson. So again, our needs are things that we need in order to survive, like water, shelter, food. Our wants are things that are kind of the luxury, fancy cars, big screen TVs, your PlayStation. Those are all wants, things that we do not need in order to survive. So, countries that have higher literacy rates have higher populations that know how to read and write. So, generally, their population is larger when it comes to individuals in workplaces. And those individuals that are making more money and better jobs, since they can read and write, generally can afford their needs and have extra money for their wants. Okay, so that's when we get into our standard of living. So, what is standard of living? The standard of living is basically the economic level of the people in a country. The standard of living in certain countries, it's often higher in countries where the literacy rate is high. So, high literacy rate equals high standard of living. Low literacy rate equals low standard of living. Okay, so you see that here. High literacy rate, arrow going up, equals high standard of living, arrow going up. Okay. Basically, what the standard of living measures, it measures how well off the people are in that country. Okay. How can they afford their housing? Can they afford food? Can they afford better health care? Afford better educational opportunities? And income can be part of the standard of living. Basically, what it costs a family in order to live. So the higher the standard of living, the better off the family is. The more money they make, which means in sense they can afford better things. They can afford more higher quality things when it comes to healthcare, educational opportunities, as far as maybe paying for college or getting an extra class, okay, to take for computers or something like that. They can afford more of those necessities or those wants in life, okay? Remember, uh, when it comes to economics, it's all about your needs and your wants, all right? So ultimately, the countries that have a higher uh, literacy rate, which means, again, more people, the higher it is, the more people over the age of 15 that can read and write, have a higher standard of living for their families. They can read, they get better jobs, they get paid more, which means they can afford more things. Okay, so the lower countries, so countries that have low literacy rates, tend to have not as good at paying jobs, which means they have a lower standard of living because they can't afford the needs that they need in order for survival. Okay, so talking about the cycle of poverty, having basic reading and writing skills is important. Without skills, workers are stuck in the lowest paying jobs. A cycle of poverty can develop when people cannot get an education. So this is where it directly impacts you. I understand that education is not for everyone. However, it's proven that the more education you have, the better success you have in the future. The better you know how to read, the better you know how to write, the better you're going to do as an adult. Okay, you have the opportunity to put yourself in a position of a high standard of living. You can get a good job, you can get higher pay, and then in sense, you can afford your wants and needs. Okay. When it comes to the cycle of poverty, if you do not get your education, all right, and you do not know how to read and write well, then you're going to be stuck in those lower paying jobs, which means your standard of living is going to be lower. Illiterate people are forced to get low paying jobs so they cannot get enough money to pay for their children's education. This cycle can continue for generations. The standard of living remains low for these families because their education level is low. So it is proven statistically that your education directly impacts your standard of living. Okay, if you have a household, okay, that it does not take education seriously, and you do not take your education seriously, and you do not get your degree, or you do not learn how to read and write well, then the chances of your standard of living increasing when you're adult are very low. Generally, it's going to stay at that same low level. Okay, so that's why it's important for you to take education seriously, learn how to read and write well, and prepare yourself for the future, because it can become cyclical. It's easy for you to get stuck in that route, and your family gets stuck in that route. If your grandparents were uneducated, your parents could be uneducated. Chances are you're going to be uneducated and be stuck in that cyclical that cycle of poverty. Okay. However, it is easy to break that simply by just taking your public education seriously, because ultimately you get that for free. You're guaranteed that here in the United States, where in other countries, kids are not guaranteed an education. Okay, a lot of the times in countries that have very low literacy rates, so very low education, they have a high cycle of poverty because the people that do have that education have to pay for it. And if you have poor families that can't afford the education, then they're not paying for the education, which means their children are then going to fall into that cycle and remain poor, since they don't know how to read and write very well. So without the skills of reading and writing, workers cannot get better jobs. Developing countries are poor, and their people are generally uneducated. It is difficult to pay for education when there is little money for food. Okay, so that comes back to our wants versus our needs conversation. In countries that are undeveloped, or countries that have low literacy rates, they generally have a very low GDP. Okay, so discussing GDP and coming back to that, we talked about it last lesson. GDP is gross domestic product, and basically it's how much money is that country making just on its own. Okay, the higher the GDP of a country, the better off that country is going to be, the wealthier that country is. The lower the GDP, okay, the poorer that country is going to be. So in these third world countries that have a very low GDP, there's not a lot of money being brought in, which means families or citizens in that country are not making a lot of money, which means they barely have money for their needs, such as food and clean drinking water and shelter. So the things such as education, their wants, are not paid for, which means that developing country continues to be poor because a majority of their population is still uneducated and still illiterate. So the goal of every country is to have a 100% literacy rate among people. Okay, the United States, as we mentioned earlier, are really close. We have 99%. One reason that many people cannot read or write is that their communities cannot afford to pay for teachers or school. Okay, so educating individuals is a major job when it comes for teachers and just educators around the world. Many government missionaries and aid groups come to the poorest countries to assist in people in educating their children. So if you have ever been to a church or anything that may have a missionary or an aid group, that goes to a third world country to try and build schools and train teachers and teach kids how to read. There's countries all around the world, not just the United States, that do that. Okay, because ultimately the goal of the world is to get every country to 100% literacy rate. Okay, that means that our global economy will increase and the standard of living for the world will increase as well. So now we're coming back to this map and we're looking at it. So now that we know that it's percentage of the population that's literate, okay, you have the yellow, which is 95% and above, the orange, which is 75% to 94%, the light purple, which is 50% to 74%, the dark purple, which is under 50%, the white is no data at all, okay? You can see that the United States, Canada, most of Europe and Russia, they're all 95% and above. Those would be considered all your first world countries, your well-developed countries, okay? If you look at some of the orange countries, so 75 to 94%, you have Brazil, you have Mexico, you have Peru, China, okay, Indonesia. All these countries are they're just below the United States. Some of them are right around that middle range, okay? And then your lower range is going to be anyone around that 50, 74 and below, 74% and below, okay? So that's a lot of your third world countries here in Africa, okay? With these low literacy rates, the education is not very good. The GDP of these countries are not going to be very good, which means the government cannot afford to increase or improve its education. Okay, we talked about capital goods in our lesson over the 4 factors. That's one of our factors. If the government cannot invest in capital goods such as education and educate their workforce, then it's not going to improve. Their economy is not going to improve, because the less educated your citizens are, the less job opportunities, the less better paying jobs there are. So this is just some information about from places around the world and what their literacy rate is. So most European countries have high literacy rates. Many European countries are industrialized. They depend on manufacturing rather than farming for their wealth. The increased wealth allows these countries to provide better education and healthcare. The standard of living is also high, okay? So better education, higher literacy rate, higher standard of living, okay? So your literacy or your standard of living really follows your literacy rate, okay? You have a high literacy rate, you have a high standard of living, which also generally means you have a high GDP. It means your country's doing well, they're wealthy, and they're making money for themselves, okay? If you have a low literacy rate, which means a low percentage of your population over the age of 15 can read or write, you'll have a low standard of living, which means they can't afford the necessities of life, healthcare, food, water. That means your GDP of your country is going to be low. UK and Germany, the literacy rate of both countries is nearly 100%. Both countries have made large investments in human capital. There's that word, one of our 4 factors. Human capital is investing in education. That's a part of human capital, okay? And that's what they've done in order to increase their literacy rate. The workforce is very well trained and educated. Again, education is key. This has helped the standard of living in these countries improve over time. Russia has the most poverty of the 3 European countries, of these 3 European countries. In the former Soviet Union, the government assigned everyone a job. Today, workers must show that they are skilled and valuable to the business in order to keep their jobs. So Russia's government is now spreading large amounts of money to train workers and educate youth so that they have more opportunities to become successful in the economy. So whenever Russia was under the USSR, they had a command economy. Remember, in a command economy, the central government makes all decisions. They tell you where you're going to work, what you're going to do, what your pay is, what you're going to make, how much you're going to sell for, and who can buy it. So the fact that they just assigned you positions, you became skilled at that one position. Now that they're opening it up and becoming more of a mixed economy, individuals need to be qualified and need to be educated in order to improve their career and get a better paying job. They didn't have those resources because Russia did not start investing in the human capital and education until relatively recently. Now, they have made major strides in that, in educating their citizens, educating their population, but they still have a long way to go. Again, the most important thing is Russia's government is now spending large amounts of money to train workers, educate youth, so that you have more opportunities to be successful in the economy. So education is important. Knowing how to read is important. If you struggle with reading, okay, the only way to get better at reading is by continuing to read. All right. It's the same way with any type of sports or anything you enjoy doing. If you're struggling at one thing, you have to continue to work at it. You have to practice in order to get better. It doesn't matter if it's hitting a curveball, doesn't matter if it's shooting free throws. You have to practice it in order to get better. Reading is the same way. Okay. Set yourself up for success by continuing to work and become a better reader if you're one of the struggling ones. All right. Because your literacy rate, being able to read and write, is going to directly impact you in the future as an adult. If you struggle with it now and you don't work at it, you're going to struggle with it later, which means it's going to hinder you when it comes to getting a better paying job. And then you have some questions here. They're going to be on a Google Doc that you're going to answer. This is just an extra copy. You can print it out if you need to. Okay. But remember, when it comes to literacy rate is key for a country's GDP and their standard of living. The higher the literacy rate, which means the more people over the age of 15 that can read and write, the higher your standard of living is, which means your citizens can afford the necessities in life to survive, plus some those luxuries. Generally, the higher the GDP for that country is going to be. And that country is going to continue to invest in those capital goods such as education in order to keep their citizens educated and keep their economy strong and moving forward. All right. I hope you guys understand. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will see you next class period.